The morning sun beat down on the courthouse steps as Officer James Mercer adjusted his uniform and took his position at the security checkpoint. 8 years on the job had taught him one thing above all else. Rules existed for a reason. The metal detector beeped steadily as the morning crowd filed through, a mix of lawyers clutching coffee cups, anxious defendants, and courthouse staff rushing to start their day. ID badges visible at all times, James called out, his voice carrying the same authority it had every morning for the past 8 years. He took pride in running a tight ship at the courthouse entrance. The regulars knew him as a stickler, someone who never bent the rules for anyone. Some of the courthouse staff rolled their eyes when they saw him on duty, knowing they'd better have their credentials perfectly displayed. Today was different, though. The Johnson case was starting, a high-profile corruption trial involving a former city council member. The media vans had started lining up before dawn, and the usual morning trickle had turned into a flood of people, all trying to get through security at once. One at a time through the detector, James barked as 2 paralegals tried to squeeze through together. Back up and do it right. His partner for the day, Officer Diane Chen, shot him a look. Maybe dial it back a notch? We've got a situation brewing here. James ignored her. In his mind, high-stress days were exactly when protocol mattered most. He'd seen what happened when security got sloppy, contraband slipping through, arguments escalating, people getting hurt. Not on his watch. The line stretched down the courthouse steps and around the corner. The summer heat wasn't helping tempers. James could feel sweat trickling down his back as he checked ID after ID, waving people through with mechanical efficiency. "Sir, I've been waiting for 20 minutes and I'm late for my hearing," a man in a rumpled suit complained. "Should have arrived earlier," James replied without looking up. "Next." Diane sighed loudly enough for him to hear. 3 hours into his shift, James had settled into a rhythm. Check ID, wave through, check belongings, next person. The morning rush was finally easing when he noticed a woman approaching the checkpoint from the side, bypassing the main line. She was tall, dressed in a navy blue pantsuit, her natural hair pulled back in a neat bun. She carried a leather briefcase and walked with the confidence of someone who belonged wherever she went. But she wasn't wearing a visible ID badge, and she wasn't waiting in line like everyone else. "Ma'am," James called out, stepping to block her path. "Back of the line, please. And I need to see your courthouse ID." The woman stopped, her expression calm but resolute. "Officer, I understand your concern, but I'm Dr. Elaine Richardson. I'm scheduled to testify in the Franklin case in courtroom 302 in," she checked her watch, "15 minutes. I've left my badge in my other jacket, but Judge Williams is expecting me." James crossed his arms. "No exceptions, ma'am. You need proper identification to enter this building." "I understand that," she said, her voice remaining level. "I'm the new chief of police. If you'll allow me to make a call, I can have someone from inside verify my identity." James felt a flicker of doubt, but quickly dismissed it. He'd heard no announcements about a new police chief, let alone a woman. And even if she was telling the truth, rules were rules. New chief or not, you still need ID to enter this courthouse. You'll have to go back to your office and get your credentials. A small crowd was forming now, courthouse regulars watching the exchange with interest. James was aware of phones being pulled out, some people filming the interaction. "Officer," Dr. Richardson tried again, "I'm not asking to bypass security. I'm simply asking you to call inside to verify my identity. I'm due in court to provide expert testimony." James felt his face growing hot. He didn't appreciate being challenged in front of everyone, especially by someone claiming authority he couldn't verify. In his 8 years, he'd heard every excuse imaginable from people trying to skip protocol. "Ma'am, step back and either join the line with proper ID or leave the premises." Dr. Richardson's patience was visibly wearing thin, but her voice remained professional. "I'm going to reach for my phone to call Judge Williams's clerk," she said, moving her hand toward her jacket pocket. James's training kicked in automatically at the sudden movement. In the high-security environment of the courthouse, any unexpected reaching motion triggered his defensive instincts. Before he could fully process what was happening, he grabbed her wrist to stop the movement. "Don't reach for anything," he ordered. Dr. Richardson pulled back, surprised by his aggressive response. "Officer, I'm simply getting my phone." What happened next occurred in a matter of seconds, though witnesses would later describe it in slow motion. As Dr. Richardson attempted to free her wrist and continue reaching for her phone, James moved to restrain her more firmly. In the ensuing struggle, his hand struck her face with considerable force, sending her staggering backward. The courthouse entrance fell silent for one long, terrible moment. Then chaos erupted. Dr. Richardson's hand went to her face, blood trickling from her split lip. The shock in her eyes quickly hardened into something else, a controlled anger that somehow seemed more frightening than outrage would have been. "Officer, you've just assaulted a public official," she said quietly, dabbing at her bleeding lip with a tissue offered by a horrified bystander. Two other security officers rushed over, positioning themselves between James and Dr. Richardson. One of them, an older officer named Tom, immediately recognized her. "Dr. Richardson, I'm so sorry, are you all right?" He turned to James with disbelief. "Do you have any idea who this is?" James stood frozen, suddenly unsure. "She doesn't have proper ID," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "This is Dr. Elaine Richardson, the new chief of police," Tom explained, his voice strained. "She was announced last Friday." There was a department-wide email. James felt the blood drain from his face. He'd taken Friday off for his daughter's school event. He hadn't checked his emails over the weekend. By now, the courthouse security supervisor had arrived, along with a court medic who immediately began examining Dr. Richardson's injuries. James could see at least a dozen phones pointed at them, recording everything. His mind raced, trying to process how quickly the situation had spiraled out of control. "Officer Mercer, step aside," his supervisor ordered. "Dr. Richardson, I cannot apologize enough. Please, let's get you inside and taken care of." Dr. Richardson nodded, maintaining her composure despite the circumstances. As the medic gently guided her toward the entrance, she paused and looked directly at James. "Officer," she said, her voice steady despite her swelling lip, "I'll be addressing this incident through proper channels. For now, I suggest you speak with your union representative." James watched as she was escorted inside, the implications of what he'd done slowly sinking in. He had assaulted his new boss, a boss he hadn't even known existed until moments ago. Within minutes, the videos were already being shared across social media. By the time James was escorted to the security office to write his incident report, local news vans were setting up outside the courthouse. His partner Diane couldn't even look at him as he was led away. In the quiet of the security office, James sat with his head in his hands. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, trying to understand how he'd misread the situation so badly. Had he truly believed Dr. Richardson was a threat, or had something else influenced his quick resort to force? The security supervisor placed a cup of water in front of him. "The internal affairs team is on their way. This isn't going to be pretty, James." James nodded, unable to find words. His career, his reputation, his future, all potentially destroyed in a split-second decision he couldn't take back. Outside, the crowds continued to file through the courthouse gates, now buzzing with discussion of what they'd witnessed, and somewhere inside the building, Dr. Elaine Richardson was preparing to testify as scheduled. Despite her injuries, demonstrating the professionalism and commitment to duty that had earned her the position James had failed to respect, the story was already spreading through every department in the city, a cautionary tale about assumptions, protocol, and power. By day's end, it would reach the evening news. By tomorrow, it would be a national conversation. But for now, it was just a man sitting alone in an office, coming to terms with the consequences of a terrible mistake. The courthouse medical room was small but clean, smelling faintly of antiseptic. Dr. Elaine Richardson sat perfectly still as the medical technician gently applied a cold compress to her swelling cheek. Her split lip had finally stopped bleeding, but the metallic taste of blood lingered in her mouth. "You should really go to the hospital, Dr. Richardson," the technician said, concern etched on her face. "You might need stitches for that lip." Elaine shook her head slightly. "After I testify. The Franklin case can't wait. That family has been through enough delays already." From the corner of the room, Judge Williams's clerk watched with a mix of horror and admiration. "I've already informed the judge about what happened. He's willing to postpone your testimony until tomorrow." "That won't be necessary," Elaine said, checking her reflection in a small mirror. The bruise was darkening rapidly against her brown skin, her bottom lip swollen to nearly twice its normal size. She touched it gingerly and winced. "Nothing's broken. I've had worse playing basketball with my sons." But despite her calm exterior, Elaine's mind was racing. 1 week into her new position as chief of police, and she'd already experienced firsthand the very problem she'd been brought in to address. The irony wasn't lost on her. Outside the medical room, the courthouse buzzed with whispers and shocked conversations. Security camera footage was already being reviewed. Statements taken from witnesses who had seen everything unfold. Officer Diane Chen had volunteered to give her account first, visibly shaken by what she'd witnessed her partner do. James has always been strict about protocol, but I've never seen him get physical like that, she explained to the internal affairs investigator who had arrived with remarkable speed, especially not with a woman who wasn't threatening him in any way. The investigator nodded, taking notes. Did Officer Mercer know who Dr. Richardson was? Diane sighed. That's just it, he should have. There was a department-wide announcement last Friday. Her picture was included. He took the day off, but still it was in his email. And even if he didn't recognize her, there was absolutely no reason to escalate to physical force. By noon, video clips of the incident were spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. The courthouse public information officer was swamped with calls from reporters, all asking variations of the same question. How could this happen? In courtroom 302, Dr. Richardson delivered her expert testimony as scheduled, her voice steady despite her injuries. The defense attorney, momentarily thrown by her appearance, had attempted to use it to discredit her state of mind. Dr. Richardson, given the traumatic event you experienced this morning, can you truly say your testimony isn't colored by your feelings about law enforcement right now? Judge Williams had nearly thrown him out of the courtroom for that. The witness's professional credentials are impeccable, counselor. Unless you have relevant questions about her forensic analysis, move on. When she finished testifying 2 hours later, Elaine found Deputy Chief Howard waiting for her in the hallway. The tall, gray-haired veteran had been her strongest supporter during the selection process for the new chief. Now his face was a storm cloud of anger and concern. I've got the mayor, the city council, and 3 community oversight groups blowing up my phone, he said, falling into step beside her, and about 50 officers asking if the videos are real. They're real, Thomas, she said quietly. But I don't want a circus. This needs to be handled by the book. They stepped into an empty conference room, and for the first time since the incident, Elaine allowed her shoulders to slump slightly. The adrenaline was wearing off and the pain was setting in. Not just physical pain, but the deeper ache of what this all represented. What's happening with Officer Mercer? She asked. Administrative leave effective immediately. His union rep is already involved. They're claiming it was a split-second safety judgment in a high-security setting. Thomas shook his head. It won't fly. Too many witnesses, too much video evidence. Elaine nodded slowly, then winced at the pain the movement caused. I need to see his personnel file. And I want the history of complaints against courthouse security going back 5 years. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You're not thinking of handling this investigation yourself, are you? The conflict of interest? Of course not, she interrupted. I'll be recusing myself officially. You'll oversee the investigation, but I need to understand the bigger picture. This isn't just about one officer or one incident. Back at the precinct, Officer James Mercer sat alone in a small room, waiting for his union representative to return with coffee. He'd already written his incident report, struggling to find words that could explain his actions without sounding like hollow excuses. The door opened, and a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense expression entered. Officer Mercer, I'm Lisa Bennett, your union representative. We need to talk strategy. James looked up, his face haggard. I messed up. There's no strategy that fixes this. Lisa sat down across from him. Listen to me carefully. This is your career on the line. The department will be under immense pressure to make an example of you, especially given who was involved. We need to emphasize your spotless record, your years of service. But I hit her, James interrupted, his voice hollow. I hit the chief of police. In front of dozens of witnesses. Because she reached for her phone. Lisa's professional demeanor cracked slightly. Yes, you did. And now we have to deal with the consequences. She leaned forward. James, I have to ask, and I need complete honesty here. Would you have reacted the same way if Dr. Richardson had been a white man in a suit claiming to be the police chief? The question hung in the air between them. James opened his mouth to answer automatically, then closed it again. For the first time, he forced himself to truly consider the question. Would he have been so quick to dismiss the credentials of a white male claiming authority? Would he have physically prevented him from reaching for his phone? The uncomfortable truth settled in his stomach like a stone. I don't think so, he finally admitted, his voice barely audible. Lisa nodded, her expression grim but not surprised. Then we have a bigger problem than just excessive force. By late afternoon, the incident had made national news. Reporters camped outside the police headquarters, hoping for a statement from Dr. Richardson. Inside, she sat in her new office, looking at Officer Mercer's personnel file. His record showed no formal disciplinary actions, but there were notes about rigid adherence to protocol and 3 complaints about unnecessarily confrontational behavior, all dismissed after brief reviews. None involved physical altercations. Until today, a soft knock on her door interrupted her reading. It was Thomas holding an ice pack and a cup of tea. The doctor called. Said you missed your follow-up appointment, he said, placing both items on her desk. I got busy, she replied, gesturing to the stack of files. Thomas took a seat without being invited. The media's waiting for your statement. PR has drafted something suitably bland about reviewing the incident and taking appropriate action. Elaine set aside Mercer's file and picked up the ice pack, holding it gently against her cheek. That won't be enough. Not for the community and not for the department. What do you want to do? She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she straightened in her chair, decision made. I want to address the department. All of them. Tonight. And I want Officer Mercer there. Thomas's eyebrows shot up. That's unconventional. So is having your chief assaulted at the courthouse on her first week. She managed a small, painful smile. Besides, I wasn't brought in because the mayor wanted conventional. As the sun began to set, officers from all shifts gathered in the largest meeting room at headquarters. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Officer James Mercer sat in the front row, a visible gap between him and the officers on either side. When Dr. Elaine Richardson walked in, the room fell completely silent. Her face was now badly bruised, the swelling obvious even in the dimmed lighting. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity she'd shown all day, moving to the podium with steady steps. For a long moment, she simply looked out at the assembled officers, meeting their eyes one by one. Some looked away. Others, including James Mercer, couldn't seem to look anywhere else. Today, she began, her voice carrying easily despite her injured lip. I experienced what too many citizens in our community have experienced, the misuse of authority, enforced by someone sworn to protect and serve. The silence in the room deepened. I could stand here and talk about policy violations, about the investigation that will follow, about consequences. But that's not why I called you all here tonight. She stepped out from behind the podium, moving closer to the officers. I called you here because what happened today isn't just about Officer Mercer and me. It's about a culture that allows snap judgments based on appearance. It's about training that emphasizes control over communication. And it's about what kind of police department we want to be for our community. In the front row, James Mercer's face showed a complex mix of shame, fear, and something else, perhaps the first glimmer of understanding. As night fell over the city, news vans remained parked outside headquarters waiting for the story to develop. Inside, a difficult conversation was just beginning, one that would eventually transform not only one officer's perspective, but an entire department's approach to the community they served. The morning after the courthouse incident, Officer James Mercer sat at his kitchen table staring at his untouched coffee. The local news played quietly on the TV in the background, but he didn't need to watch it. He'd lived it. His phone had been buzzing nonstop with texts from fellow officers, some offering support, others keeping a careful distance. He hadn't answered any of them. His wife Tricia moved around the kitchen getting their daughter ready for school, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. But the tension was impossible to ignore. "Daddy, are you sick?" 7-year-old Lily asked, noticing his stillness. James forced a smile. "No, sweetheart. Just tired." "Have a good day at school, okay?" After Tricia and Lily left, the house fell into a heavy silence. James picked up his phone and, against his better judgment, opened social media. His stomach dropped. Video clips of the incident were everywhere, along with passionate debates about police conduct, racial bias, and appropriate use of force. His name was attached to all of it. One comment thread caught his eye. A former academy classmate had written, "I trained with Mercer. He's not a bad guy, but he's always been wound too tight. Always black and white with him, no gray area." Another officer had responded, "Yeah, but would he have hit a white guy in a suit claiming to be the chief?" We all know the answer. James closed the app and pushed his phone away, the question echoing what his union rep had asked him yesterday. The uncomfortable truth he'd been avoiding was becoming impossible to ignore. Across town at police headquarters, the internal affairs investigation was moving with unusual speed. Deputy Chief Thomas Howard had assembled a team of investigators, carefully selected for their reputation for fairness and thoroughness. "I want this done by the book," he told them during their morning briefing. "No corners cut, no assumptions made. Interview everyone who witnessed the incident. Review all camera footage. Check Officer Mercer's entire service record, including any complaints that didn't result in formal action." One of the investigators raised her hand. "Sir, given the public attention, there's going to be pressure to reach a quick conclusion. How do we handle that?" Thomas's expression was firm. "We handle it by doing our jobs right. Dr. Richardson has made it clear that she wants a fair and complete investigation, not a rush to judgment. She's recused herself from direct involvement to ensure there's no conflict of interest." "And what about the protests?" another investigator asked. Outside police headquarters, a crowd had been gathering since dawn. Community activists held signs reading "Accountability Now" and "Who Polices the Police." Local news crews captured it all, broadcasting live updates throughout the morning. "We acknowledge their right to peaceful protest," Thomas replied. "And we prove through our actions that we're committed to transparency and justice, no matter who's involved." In her office, Dr. Richardson reviewed the preliminary incident reports, while a department photographer documented her injuries for the official record. The bruising had darkened overnight, creating a stark purple mark across her cheekbone. Her lip remained swollen, making it difficult to speak clearly. A knock at her door revealed the mayor's chief of staff, looking anxious. "Dr. Richardson, the mayor is concerned about the department's image. He's suggesting a joint press conference this afternoon to show unified leadership and announce Officer Mercer's termination." Elaine set down the report she'd been reading. "Tell the mayor I appreciate his concern, but we will not be announcing any disciplinary decisions until the investigation is complete." "But the video is clear." "The video shows what happened, yes. But proper procedure matters, especially now." She met his gaze steadily. "If we rush this because the officer involved hit me, the chief, what message does that send about how we handle cases involving ordinary citizens? I was brought in to change the culture of this department, not to demand special treatment." The chief of staff left looking unsatisfied. Moments later, Thomas Howard entered with a thick file folder. "You might want to see this," he said, placing the folder on her desk. "We pulled the complete records on Officer Mercer, including informal complaints that never made it to official review." Elaine opened the folder and began reading. There were patterns she hadn't seen in the official file. Multiple complaints about Mercer's rigid enforcement style from courthouse visitors of color, all dismissed by his supervisors as misunderstandings or protocol adherence. None had involved physical force, but the pattern was troubling. His direct supervisor wrote here that Mercer was ideal for courthouse duty because he never makes exceptions, she noted, pointing to a performance review. "They framed his inflexibility as a strength," Thomas nodded. "There's more. We've been interviewing courthouse staff. Several mentioned feeling that Mercer was harder on certain types of people, young men of color, women who questioned his authority, but no one ever filed formal complaints because, in their words, he was just doing his job." Elaine closed the folder, her expression thoughtful despite the pain it caused. "It's not just about one officer, is it? It's about a system that rewards certain behaviors without examining their impact." By late afternoon, the investigation team had interviewed 23 witnesses, reviewed security camera footage from multiple angles, and compiled a preliminary report. The evidence was overwhelming. Officer Mercer had used excessive force against an unarmed individual who posed no threat. But something unexpected was happening at the same time. While protesters continued their vigil outside headquarters, community leaders had requested a meeting with Dr. Richardson. To everyone's surprise, she had agreed. despite her injuries and the ongoing investigation. The meeting took place in a community center in one of the city's historically black neighborhoods. Dr. Richardson arrived without a security detail, accompanied only by Thomas Howard and the department's community liaison officer. Inside, representatives from various community organizations waited, civil rights groups, neighborhood associations, youth programs, and church leaders. When Elaine walked in, her bruised face visible to all, a hush fell over the room. An elderly woman who had been a civil rights activist since the 1960s spoke first. "Dr. Richardson, we're deeply troubled by what happened to you, but we're also concerned that this incident will be treated as an isolated case rather than a symptom of larger problems." Elaine nodded carefully. "That's exactly why I wanted to meet with you today. This can't be just about one officer and one incident." For the next 2 hours, she mostly listened as community members shared their experiences with law enforcement. Stories of disrespect, of excessive force, of complaints ignored. She took notes, asked clarifying questions, and promised nothing except that she would take their concerns seriously. "I can't change years of broken trust in one day," she told them toward the end of the meeting. "But I can promise you this. What happened to me will not be swept under the rug, and neither will your experiences. The changes we need go beyond disciplining one officer." As the meeting concluded, the civil rights elder approached her privately. "You know," she said, studying Elaine's face, "some folks are saying it was almost fitting, the new chief experiencing firsthand what community members have complained about for years." Elaine met her gaze. "If that's what it takes to create real change, then maybe something good can come from this after all." Back at his home, Officer James Mercer received a call from Internal Affairs. He was scheduled for a formal interview the following morning. His union representative had advised him to stick to the facts, emphasize the security protocols, and avoid speculating about his motivations. But as he sat alone in his living room that evening, James found himself replaying the incident in his mind over and over. The way he'd dismissed Dr. Richardson's explanation without really listening, the automatic suspicion when she'd reached for her phone, the split-second decision to use force rather than de-escalate. Would he have reacted the same way to a white man in a business suit? The question wouldn't leave him alone. His daughter's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Dad, are you in trouble? Kids at school were talking about a police officer who hit someone. They said it was you." James felt his heart sink. He patted the sofa beside him and Lily climbed up, looking at him with worried eyes. "Yes, I'm in trouble," he said quietly. "I made a big mistake at work. I hurt someone I shouldn't have hurt. Did you say sorry?" The simple question hit him like a punch to the gut. In all the chaos, the administrative leave, the investigation, the media coverage, he hadn't once considered the most basic human response. "No," he admitted. "I haven't said sorry yet. Mom says when you make a mistake, you have to own it and try to fix it," Lily said with the straightforward wisdom of children. James hugged his daughter close, his mind racing. The investigation would take its course. There would be findings, recommendations, consequences. But regardless of all that, there was something he needed to do first, something that no policy manual or union representative would advise. He needed to apologize to the woman he had harmed. That night, as the city's news programs led with updates on the investigation, 2 people lay awake in different parts of town, both wrestling with how this incident would change not just their own lives, but potentially the entire relationship between the police department and the community it served. The interview room felt smaller than James remembered. From his years of witnessing suspect interviews from the other side of the table, now sitting beside his union representative, facing 2 internal affairs investigators, he understood why people found these rooms so intimidating. "Officer Mercer, please state for the record your account of the events that occurred at the courthouse entrance on Monday morning," the lead investigator said, her voice neutral but her eyes watchful. James cleared his throat. He'd rehearsed this with his union rep, going over the security protocols, the busy morning, the high-profile case creating tension. But as he opened his mouth, his daughter's simple question echoed in his mind. "Did you say sorry?" "Before I give my statement," he said, surprising even himself, "I want to acknowledge that I made a serious error in judgment that resulted in harm to Dr. Richardson. My actions were wrong, and they were mine alone." His union representative shifted uncomfortably beside him. This wasn't the carefully crafted opening they'd prepared. The investigators exchanged glances, then nodded for him to continue. For the next hour, James recounted the events in detail, not just what happened, but his thought process throughout. How he'd automatically dismissed Dr. Richardson's claim to be the new police chief because it didn't fit his mental image of what a chief looked like. How he'd perceived her reaching for her phone as a potential threat, despite no evidence of hostile intent. How his training had emphasized control above all else. Would you have responded the same way if Dr. Richardson had been a white man in a business suit? One investigator asked directly. James was quiet for a long moment before answering. I've been asking myself that question since it happened, and I have to be honest, I don't think I would have. Can you elaborate on that? He took a deep breath. I think I carried assumptions I wasn't even aware of. When a black woman claimed authority, I was skeptical automatically. When she reached for something, I assumed the worst automatically. I didn't give her the benefit of the doubt I might have given someone else. His union rep looked like she wanted to interrupt, but James continued. I'm not saying this to excuse what I did, just the opposite. I need to own not just the action, but the thinking behind it. When the interview concluded, his representative pulled him aside in the hallway. That was not the strategy we discussed. You essentially admitted to bias-motivated misconduct. I admitted to the truth, James replied quietly. I can't fix what I don't acknowledge. Across town at police headquarters, Dr. Richardson was meeting with the department's training coordinator. Her injuries were beginning to heal. The swelling in her lip reduced, though the bruise on her face had turned a deep purple blue. Chief, I've reviewed our current training materials as you requested, the coordinator explained, spreading documents across the conference table. Our use of force training emphasizes compliance first, de-escalation second. It's been the standard approach for years. Elaine studied the materials thoughtfully. And the cultural competency training? The coordinator looked uncomfortable. It's a 4-hour module, mandatory once every 3 years. 4 hours every 3 years to address something officers face every day? Elaine shook her head slightly. That's not nearly enough. A knock at the door interrupted them. Deputy Chief Howard entered with a folder in hand. The interview with Officer Mercer just concluded. I thought you'd want to see the transcript right away. Elaine took the folder but didn't open it immediately. Your impression? Thomas considered his words carefully. Not what I expected. He didn't try to justify his actions or minimize what happened. In fact, he was harder on himself than the investigators were. This caught her attention. She opened the folder and began reading, her expression revealing nothing as she moved through the transcript. When she finished, she closed the folder and was quiet for a long moment. He's requesting to speak with you directly, Thomas added, off the record. His union rep is strongly against it, but he's insisting. The training coordinator looked alarmed. Chief, that would be highly unusual during an active investigation. Elaine tapped her fingers on the closed folder. Sometimes unusual circumstances call for unusual responses. She looked up at Thomas. What's your recommendation? Professionally speaking, there's no reason you need to meet with him. The investigation is proceeding properly, he paused, but from a human perspective, it might be valuable. For both of you. That evening, as most of the administrative staff were leaving for the day, Officer James Mercer arrived at police headquarters. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a button-down shirt, having been instructed not to wear his uniform while on administrative leave. The desk sergeant nodded to him awkwardly as he signed in. The strange tension of a fellow officer now under investigation, making their usual easy camaraderie impossible. James was escorted to a small conference room, not the chief's office, a neutral space chosen deliberately for this unusual meeting. When Dr. Richardson entered, accompanied by Thomas Howard, James stood automatically. The bruising on her face was unmistakable, and he found it difficult to look directly at the physical evidence of what he'd done. Officer Mercer, she greeted him, her voice professional but not cold. I understand you wanted to speak with me. James nodded. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Thomas positioned himself near the door, present but giving them space. Elaine took a seat across from James, placing a small recorder on the table between them. For transparency, she explained, I'm recording this conversation. It won't be part of the official investigation, unless there's relevant information that needs to be included. Is that acceptable to you? Yes, ma'am. An awkward silence fell. James had rehearsed what he wanted to say dozens of times, but now, face to face with the woman he'd harmed, the carefully prepared words felt inadequate. "I owe you an apology," he finally said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "What I did was wrong, and I am deeply sorry for hurting you." Elaine watched him thoughtfully but didn't interrupt. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since it happened," he continued, "about why I reacted the way I did, about the assumptions I made without even realizing I was making them." He met her eyes directly for the first time. "I know an apology doesn't undo what happened, and I know there will be consequences for my actions. I'm not here to ask for leniency." "Then why are you here, Officer Mercer?" she asked quietly. "Because I needed you to hear directly from me that I understand what I did was wrong, not just breaking protocol or using excessive force, though it was both of those things, but the underlying thinking that led to it." He took a deep breath. "And because my 7-year-old daughter asked me if I'd said sorry, and I had to tell her no." Something in Elaine's expression softened slightly. "Tell me about your daughter." It wasn't what James had expected her to say, but he answered, "Her name is Lily. She's in 2nd grade. Smart as a whip and not afraid to ask tough questions." A small, sad smile crossed his face. "She told me her teacher says when you make a mistake you need to own it and try to fix it." "Sounds like a wise teacher," Elaine commented. "And how do you plan to fix this, Officer Mercer?" The question hung in the air between them, not just about the incident but about the deeper issues it had exposed. "I don't know if I can fix it completely," he admitted, "but I want to start by being honest. With you, with the department, and with myself, about the biases I didn't want to admit I had." He paused. "And I want to be part of making sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Elaine studied him for a long moment. "The investigation will reach its conclusion and there will be official consequences. That process needs to proceed without interference, but I appreciate your willingness to take personal responsibility." She leaned forward slightly. "This department is at a crossroads, Officer Mercer. What happened between us is forcing conversations that are long overdue. About training, about bias, about the culture we've created. The question is what we do with this moment." James nodded slowly. "Whatever happens with my case, I hope something good can come from it, even if that means being the example of what needs to change." As the meeting concluded, Thomas escorted James back to the lobby. Neither man spoke until they reached the front entrance. "Was it worth it?" Thomas asked quietly. "Speaking with her?" James looked back toward the direction they'd come from. "Yes, not because it changes anything about the investigation or what happens to me, but because it was the right thing to do." He hesitated. "She's going to be good for this department, isn't she?" "If we let her be," Thomas replied. "Change never comes easy." The next morning, the Internal Affairs team delivered their completed report to Deputy Chief Howard. The findings were clear. Officer Mercer had violated department policy on use of force, had escalated a situation unnecessarily, and had failed to properly identify a high-ranking official despite departmental notifications. But attached to the official report was a supplemental note about Officer Mercer's unusual level of personal accountability, and his acknowledgement of bias influencing his actions, something rarely seen in such investigations. Meanwhile, Dr. Richardson stood before a room of senior officers, her bruised face a stark visual reminder of why they were gathered. "Today we begin a department-wide training overhaul," she announced. "Not a 4-hour seminar or a checkbox exercise, but a fundamental re-examination of how we train our officers to interact with the public they serve." She projected a slide showing the new training priorities. De-escalation first, force as a last resort. Ongoing bias recognition training, not just once every 3 years. Community engagement as a core competency, not an optional add-on. "Some of you may see this as an overreaction to one isolated incident," she acknowledged, "but I see it as an opportunity to address issues that have been simmering beneath the surface for years. What happened to me was not unique, it was just unique that it happened to the chief." As she spoke, James Mercer was meeting with his union representative one more time, reviewing the investigation findings and preparing for the disciplinary hearing that would determine his future with the department. "They're recommending termination," his rep said bluntly. "With this level of evidence and public attention, I don't see that changing." But given your cooperation and personal accountability, there's a chance you could resign instead." James absorbed this in silence. He'd known it was coming, had accepted it as the likely outcome. Still, hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "What would you do?" he asked quietly. His rep sighed. "Honestly, I'd fight it. That's my job, to advocate for officers. But this case," she shook her head. "Sometimes the best thing you can do is accept the consequences with dignity and focus on what comes next." James nodded slowly, thinking of his conversation with Dr. Richardson, of his daughter's question, of the officer he'd been and the person he wanted to be. "Then that's what I'll do," he said finally. "Accept the consequences and figure out what comes next." 3 weeks had passed since the courthouse incident. The city had moved on to other headlines, other crises, but within the police department the ripple effects continued to spread. Today would bring it all to a head. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock. James Mercer arrived 30 minutes early, dressed in his best suit, not his uniform, with his wife Tricia beside him. They sat in the waiting area outside the conference room, neither speaking much. There wasn't much left to say. "No matter what happens in there," Tricia finally said, squeezing his hand, "we'll get through it." James nodded, grateful for her support, despite everything. The past weeks had been hard on all of them. Lily had faced questions at school. Tricia had endured the whispers at the grocery store. James himself had barely slept, his mind constantly replaying not just the incident, but all the moments throughout his career that he now saw in a different light. Inside the conference room, the disciplinary board was assembling, 3 senior officers from outside precincts chosen for their neutrality, along with Deputy Chief Howard and a civilian oversight representative. Dr. Richardson, as the victim in the case, had recused herself from the formal process but had submitted a written statement. Thomas Howard checked his watch. "We should get started." The door opened, but instead of a clerk coming to fetch James, it was Dr. Richardson herself who entered. The room fell silent as she took a seat at the far end of the table, separate from the board members. "I thought you weren't participating in the hearing," Thomas said quietly. "I'm not here as the chief or as the victim," she replied. "I'm here as an observer. The outcome affects my department, and I need to witness it firsthand." Her face had healed considerably. The bruising had faded to a yellowish shadow, and her lip was no longer swollen, though a small scar remained where it had split. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the ordeal. At exactly 10 o'clock, James was brought in. His eyes briefly met Dr. Richardson's, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he composed himself and took his seat across from the board. The hearing proceeded with formal precision. The investigation findings were presented. Video evidence was reviewed. Witness statements were read into the record. James's service history was discussed, both the commendations and the pattern of complaints that had never resulted in discipline. When it came time for James to address the board, he stood, hands clasped before him to hide their slight trembling. "I've had 3 weeks to think about what I would say today," he began. "I've written and rewritten my statement dozens of times. But in the end it comes down to this. I made a serious mistake that day at the courthouse. A mistake born not just of poor judgment in the moment, but of biases I had never fully acknowledged to myself." He glanced briefly at Dr. Richardson before continuing. "I've heard people defend me by saying I was just following protocol, that I was doing my job. But that's not true. My job was to ensure security while treating everyone with respect and using appropriate levels of force. I failed at that job." One of the board members leaned forward. "Officer Mercer, your union representative has informed us that you're not contesting the findings or the recommended termination. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir, that's correct. May I ask why?" "Most officers in your position would fight this." James took a deep breath, because fighting it would send the wrong message, to the department, to the community, and to my daughter. It would say that I don't believe I did anything seriously wrong or that I think the rules shouldn't apply to me. He straightened his shoulders. "I believe in accountability. If I fought this, I'd be undermining the very principles I swore to uphold when I became an officer." The board members exchanged glances, clearly not having expected this response. The civilian oversight representative made a note on her pad. "Is there anything else you'd like to say before we deliberate?" the senior board member asked. James nodded. Just this. Whatever happens today, I hope my mistake becomes a catalyst for positive change in the department. If other officers can learn from what I did wrong, then at least something good will have come from it. The board asked him to wait outside while they discussed their decision. It was merely a formality. The recommendation for termination had been clear, and James had accepted it, but protocol had to be followed. In the hallway, he was surprised to find Dr. Richardson waiting. "Chief," he acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Mr. Mercer," she replied, deliberately using the civilian form of address. An awkward silence fell between them. Then she gestured to a nearby bench and they both sat, maintaining a careful distance. "I read your full statement to Internal Affairs," she said, "about the biases you recognized in yourself. That couldn't have been easy to admit." James looked down at his hands. "Not as hard as living with what I did. Do you know what stood out to me in that transcript?" she asked. "You didn't just acknowledge what you did wrong. You recognized why you did it. That's much rarer." He looked at her, uncertain where she was going with this. "The board is going to terminate your employment," she said matter-of-factly. "We both know that. But I'm curious about what you plan to do afterward." James hadn't expected the question. Most of his energy had been focused on getting through the hearing itself, not what came after. "I haven't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "Find another job, I guess. Probably not in law enforcement." Dr. Richardson was quiet for a moment, studying him thoughtfully. What if there was a different option? Not as an officer, but as part of the solution to the problems your case has highlighted? Before she could explain further, the door opened and they were called back into the conference room. The board had reached its decision. James stood before them as the senior member read the formal statement. Based on the evidence presented and the officer's own testimony, this board finds that Officer James Mercer violated department policies regarding use of force, professional conduct, and bias-free policing. The board recommends immediate termination of employment. It was exactly what everyone had expected, yet hearing it stated officially still hit James like a physical blow. His career of 12 years, the only job he'd ever wanted, was over. "Officer Mercer," the senior board member continued, "do you wish to make any final statement?" James swallowed hard. "I accept the board's decision. I apologize to Dr. Richardson, to the department, and to the community for my actions. Thank you for your fairness in this process." As the hearing concluded, James shook hands with his former colleagues one last time. Some couldn't meet his eyes. Others gripped his hand firmly, silently acknowledging the difficulty of the moment. Dr. Richardson waited until the others had filed out before approaching him. "I'd like you to come to my office tomorrow morning at 9, she said quietly. "There's something I want to discuss with you." James looked surprised but nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The next morning, James arrived at police headquarters feeling strange without his badge and uniform. The desk sergeant gave him a visitor's pass with an awkward smile, and a clerk escorted him to the chief's office. Dr. Richardson wasn't alone. With her was a woman James didn't recognize, middle-aged, with a no-nonsense demeanor and a folder of documents. "Mr. Mercer, this is Gloria Washington from our Community Oversight Committee," Dr. Richardson explained after introductions. "I've asked her to join us because what I'm about to propose involves her department as well." James sat down, curious and slightly nervous. "Yesterday I asked what you plan to do next," Dr. Richardson began. "Now I'd like to make a suggestion. We're creating a new training program on bias recognition and de-escalation. It will be mandatory for all officers starting next month." She leaned forward slightly. "What made your internal affairs statement powerful was your honesty about recognizing biases you didn't know you had. That kind of self-awareness and accountability is exactly what we need to teach." James began to understand where she was heading. "You want me to be involved in the training?" "I want you to help develop it and then help teach it," she corrected. "As a civilian consultant, working alongside community representatives like Ms. Washington, your perspective as someone who's been on both sides of this issue would be invaluable." He was stunned. "You're offering me a job? After what I did to you?" Dr. Richardson touched the faint scar on her lip unconsciously. "Not despite what you did, but because of how you've responded to it. It would be a missed opportunity to let your experience walk out the door when it could help change the culture that made it possible." Gloria Washington spoke up. "The Community Oversight Committee has been pushing for this kind of training for years. Having someone like you involved, someone who can speak candidly about these issues from a former officer's perspective, could make officers more receptive to it. James looked back and forth between the two women, overwhelmed by what they were suggesting. I don't know what to say. You don't have to answer right now, Dr. Richardson assured him. Take some time to think about it. Talk it over with your family. But James didn't need time. In that moment, he saw a path forward that he hadn't imagined possible. Not a second chance at being an officer, but a chance to help prevent other officers from making the same mistakes he had. I'd be honored, he said simply. If you really think I can help, I want to try. 6 months later, the first group of officers completed the new training program. The evaluations were overwhelmingly positive, with many citing the joint sessions led by James and community members as the most impactful part of the experience. Dr. Richardson stood at the back of the room during the final session, watching as James shared his story with unflinching honesty. The split-second decision that ended his career. The biases he hadn't recognized until it was too late, and the lessons he'd learned since then. The hardest part, he told the officers, wasn't losing my job. It was facing the truth about why I did what I did. But you have an opportunity I didn't have, to recognize these patterns before they lead to harm. As the session ended, Dr. Richardson slipped out quietly. Her work taking the department in a new direction was far from finished, but moments like this confirmed she was on the right path. What had begun as a shocking act of violence had transformed into something unexpected, a catalyst for change, not just for one officer or one department, but potentially for police-community relations throughout the city. The journey hadn't been easy for anyone involved, but as Dr. Richardson often reminded her command staff, the most meaningful changes rarely were.